Every country on Earth is drowning in debt. The United States owes $38 trillion. Japan owes $9 trillion. China's total debt exceeds $50 trillion. The entire planet owes $315 trillion. That's 3 times the size of the global economy. But here's the question that should keep you awake at night. If every nation, every corporation, every government is in debt, who exactly are they in debt to? Track the money. Track the creditors. Trace who actually holds all this debt, and you'll discover something that will fundamentally change how you see the world. The money isn't owed to some external entity. The world owes money to itself. It's a closed loop, a circular system where everyone is both debtor and creditor simultaneously. But that's not an accident. That's not some natural evolution of finance. 4 men, 4 architects across 3 different centuries deliberately designed it that way. They built a trap so sophisticated, so elegant, that most people don't even realize they're caught inside it. They created a system where debt can never be repaid, where governments must borrow forever, where interest flows eternally upward like a river that only runs one direction, and where the people who engineered the mechanism profit from every payment, every crisis, every bailout, every moment of every day. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented history. The meetings happened. The contracts exist. The mechanisms are public record. You can look them up. And once you understand how they built it, once you see the architecture of the trap, you'll realize why $36 trillion isn't a problem to be solved. It's not a crisis. It's not a mistake. It's the system working exactly as intended. It's the machine humming along perfectly. Let me show you the 4 architects, the 4 moments in history when the trap was engineered, and why every government on Earth is now caught inside it, with absolutely no way out.
Before 1694, kings borrowed money the primitive way. They would approach wealthy merchants or nobles, promise repayment with interest, and if they couldn't pay, they would default. The creditors would lose their money. The king would find someone else to borrow from. It was risky for lenders, embarrassing for monarchs, but it was contained. Debt was temporary. It either got repaid or it got defaulted. The system cleared itself. The slate wiped clean. William Paterson changed everything. He was a Scottish merchant and financial schemer who had tried and failed multiple times to get rich. He'd attempted to establish a colony in Panama that ended in disaster. He'd proposed various trading schemes that went nowhere. But in 1691, he had an idea that would literally reshape human civilization. England was at war with France. King William III desperately needed money. The royal treasury was empty, tax revenue couldn't cover the cost of war, and traditional lenders were refusing new loans because England had a history of defaulting. The king's credit was terrible. Paterson approached the king with a proposal that seemed too good to be true. He would organize a group of wealthy London merchants to lend the government £1.2 million. In today's money, that's roughly $300 million, a massive sum for the time. But here's the innovation, the moment that changed everything. The loan would never be repaid. Not eventually, not someday, never. Instead of repaying the principal, the government would pay interest forever, 8% annually in perpetuity. And to manage this arrangement, to oversee this new eternal debt, Paterson proposed creating an entirely new institution, the Bank of England.
The mechanics were revolutionary. The merchant lenders would deposit their gold with the Bank of England. The bank would lend that gold to the government. The government would pay 8% interest annually, drawn from tax revenue. The bank would distribute that interest to the merchant lenders. But here's the critical detail that changes everything. The government would never, ever repay the principal amount. The loan was permanent, structural, eternal. Now you might ask, why would merchants accept this deal? Why lend money you'll never get back? Because the interest payment was guaranteed by an act of Parliament. It was backed by the government's power to tax its citizens. As long as England existed, as long as it could extract taxes from its population, the money would flow. It was guaranteed, certain, forever.
And there was another brilliant detail. The banknotes the lenders received in exchange for their gold could be traded, sold, transferred. They were as good as money. Actually, they were better than money, because unlike gold sitting in a vault, these notes paid interest. They were productive assets. Parliament approved Paterson's scheme in July 1694. The Bank of England was officially chartered. The merchants provided their gold, the government received its war funding, and for the first time in human history, national debt became permanent. Not a problem to solve, a feature of the system. Here's what nobody explains about why this was so brilliant for the bankers. The government owed £1.2 million. At 8% interest, that's £96,000 per year forever. The merchants had essentially purchased an annuity from the government, an infinite income stream. As long as England existed, as long as it could tax its people, the money would flow into their pockets. And if they wanted their gold back, they didn't get it from the government. They sold the banknotes to someone else. The debt was transferable between private parties, but never repayable to the government. But Paterson's real genius, the thing that makes this diabolical, was what came next. The Bank of England was given the legal right to issue banknotes backed by the government's debt. They could print paper money up to the value of the loan. Think about what this means. This created money out of debt. The government's IOU became currency. The promise to pay became the payment itself. And here's the key. The more the government borrowed, the more money could be created.
This is the template, the original design. Government borrows, never repays the principal, pays interest forever, and the debt itself becomes money circulating in the economy. It's absolutely brilliant if you're a banker. It's catastrophic if you're a taxpayer, because you are now paying interest on debt that will never, ever disappear. Within 50 years, every major European power copied the model. France created the Banque Générale. The Netherlands, already sophisticated in banking, formalized government debt issuance. Sweden established the Riksbank, and by 1790, the newly independent United States adopted the exact same system. Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, explicitly modeled America's financial system on the Bank of England. He'd studied it, admired it. He argued passionately that the United States needed permanent debt, that the debt should never be fully repaid, that it would create confidence, establish credit, and enable commerce. He won the argument. The first Bank of the United States was chartered in 1791, operating on Paterson's principles. Permanent debt, interest paid from taxes, bonds traded as currency. Paterson died in 1719, not particularly wealthy despite creating the Bank of England. He'd sold his shares early and spent his later years in obscurity. But the system he built persists. 331 years later, the Bank of England still exists. British government debt has never been paid off. It's been refinanced, rolled over, expanded, inflated away partially, but never eliminated. Never zero. The trap was set in 1694, and every government since has walked into it willingly because they were told it was progress, that it was sophisticated financial management, that permanent debt was a sign of a mature economy. Before we continue with how this trap was expanded and perfected, I need you to do something. If you're starting to see how the machine actually works, if this is connecting dots you've never connected before, hit that subscribe button right now. Ring the bell so you don't miss the next parts of this story. And comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I want to see how far this information spreads. Because they don't teach this in schools. They don't explain this in economics courses. And there's a reason for that. Now, let's see who took Paterson's invention and turned it into a global empire.
By the early 1800s, European governments had embraced debt. They borrowed for wars, for infrastructure, for operating expenses. But the system was still primitive. Each loan was negotiated individually. Interest rates varied wildly depending on the king's reputation, and only the wealthiest merchants could participate. The market was fragmented, local, inefficient. Nathan Rothschild changed that forever. He didn't just participate in sovereign debt. He industrialized it. He turned it into a machine. The Rothschild family started as coin dealers and traders in the Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt. Mayer Amschel Rothschild, the patriarch, had 5 sons, and in an era when most families stayed in one place, he did something unprecedented. He sent each son to a different major European city to establish banking houses. James went to Paris, Solomon went to Vienna, Nathan went to London, Carl went to Naples, Amschel stayed in Frankfurt. This created a network that had never existed before. 5 brothers, 5 cities, 5 banking houses, all coordinated, all sharing information, all moving money across borders faster than any government, any military, any competitor. In an age when communication traveled at the speed of horses and ships, the Rothschilds had a private intelligence network that gave them days, sometimes weeks of advantage over everyone else. Nathan Rothschild in London was the strategic genius of the family. During the Napoleonic Wars, while Britain was fighting for its survival against France, Nathan arranged loans for the British government. But his innovation wasn't just lending money. It was how he structured the deals.
Instead of lending directly to the government and waiting years for repayment, he bought government bonds at a discount and immediately resold them to investors at a markup. He created a secondary market, a trading system. The government needed money instantly. Nathan provided it. Then he sold the bonds to pension funds, insurance companies, wealthy aristocrats across Europe. The government got its funding immediately. Rothschild collected the spread, the difference between what he paid and what he sold for. And investors got a tradable asset that paid interest. But here's where the story gets darker, where you see the real power being wielded. Rothschild didn't just finance governments. He positioned himself so that governments had no choice but to use him. He made himself indispensable, irreplaceable. The Battle of Waterloo, June 18th, 1815. This was the decisive battle that would end the Napoleonic Wars. If Napoleon won, French dominance would continue. If Britain and its allies won, the balance of power would shift. Fortunes would be made or lost based on the outcome. And according to widely reported accounts, Nathan Rothschild received news of the result before anyone else in London. Rothschild had established a private courier network that was faster than official military channels. The story goes that his agent watched the battle, then raced to the coast, crossed the English Channel, and delivered the news to Nathan in London a full day before the official government messenger arrived. What happened next has been told many ways over the years, with some details disputed by historians. But the core account, reported by contemporary sources, goes like this. Nathan walked onto the floor of the London Stock Exchange and started selling British bonds, heavily, publicly. The market knew Rothschild had the best information network in Europe. If Rothschild was selling British bonds, it could only mean one thing. Britain was losing. Napoleon had won. Panic spread. Other investors started dumping British bonds. Prices collapsed. The market was in free fall. And then quietly, through agents and intermediaries, Rothschild started buying massive quantities at rock-bottom prices. He bought from the panicked investors who thought they were saving themselves from total loss. When the official news of Wellington's victory arrived the next day, bond prices exploded upward. The exact profit Rothschild made has been debated by historians, with estimates varying widely. But what's documented is that Rothschild capital increased dramatically in the years following Waterloo. What's certain is that this established something more important than one fortune. It established the Rothschild model. Control the information, control the issuance, control the market, and governments become dependent on you. By 1820, the Rothschilds dominated European sovereign debt. If a government needed to borrow, they went through the Rothschilds, because the Rothschilds controlled the investor network. They had the distribution channels across 5 countries. They set the terms. They determined the interest rates. They decided who could borrow and who couldn't. Here's why this matters for understanding the trap. Before Rothschild, governments could theoretically refuse to pay their debts. If a king defaulted, his creditors lost money and the system reset. New creditors would eventually appear. But Rothschild made sovereign debt tradable across international borders and between countless parties. A British government bond might be owned by a French insurance company, which used it as collateral for a loan to a German bank,
which sold it to an Austrian pension fund, which pledged it to secure a loan from a Dutch merchant house. The web of ownership became so complex, so interconnected, that defaulting wasn't just refusing to pay one creditor, it was collapsing an entire international financial network. It was triggering a systemic crisis that would destroy the credit of every institution involved. This is the Rothschild innovation. Make debt so interconnected, so globally distributed, that default becomes impossible. Not because governments are morally obligated to pay, not because they fear God or reputation, because default would trigger a systemic collapse that would destroy the entire European financial system, including the government's own economy. Governments became trapped. They had to keep paying the interest, and they had to keep borrowing new money to pay the interest on old debts. The debt trap was no longer just permanent, as Paterson designed it, now it was inescapable. Trying to exit would cause more damage than staying in. The Rothschild family wealth peaked in the mid-1800s. They were the richest family in the world, richer than any king, richer than any government. And that wealth came from one source: interest on sovereign debt. They didn't produce anything, they didn't manufacture goods, they didn't build infrastructure. They lent money to governments and collected interest forever. This system Paterson created in 1694, Rothschild perfected and globalized by 1815, and every government in Europe was caught inside it.
By 1900, America was becoming an economic superpower. It had vast natural resources, explosive industrial growth, waves of immigration providing labor, but it still had a primitive, chaotic financial system. Banks operated independently with no coordination. The money supply was tied rigidly to gold reserves, and there was no central mechanism to manage credit, control interest rates, or handle financial crises. This created periodic disasters. The Panic of 1893, the Panic of 1907, bank runs, stock market crashes, economic seizures where money simply stopped flowing and the entire system froze. J.P. Morgan fixed that, not for the public good, to protect his banking empire and the wealth of his class. In October 1907, a financial panic erupted. The Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of New York's largest financial institutions, collapsed. Depositors panicked. They rushed to withdraw money from other banks, credit froze, stock prices crashed. The entire American economy was on the verge of complete collapse. There was no central bank, no Federal Reserve, no institution to inject liquidity or restore confidence. So J.P. Morgan, a private citizen, personally organized the bailout. He gathered the most powerful bankers in New York in his library. He literally locked the doors and refused to let them leave until they agreed to pledge their own money to stabilize the failing banks. It worked. Morgan's personal credibility and the combined resources of the major banks stopped the panic. But Morgan was 70 years old. He'd saved the system through force of personality, but he knew he couldn't do it again. He wouldn't live forever, and the system couldn't rely on one man. So Morgan and his closest associates, the most powerful bankers in America, designed a permanent solution. They needed a central bank that could create money, buy government bonds, control interest rates, and manage crises. But there was a massive political problem. Americans hated central banks. The first Bank of the United States had been shut down in 1811 after its charter expired, opposed by populists who saw it as a tool of wealthy elites. The second Bank of the United States had been destroyed by President Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, who called it a monster that represented concentrated financial power. So Morgan's group couldn't just propose a central bank, they had to disguise it, make it look democratic, decentralized, controlled by the government rather than by Wall Street.
In November 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was related to the Rockefellers by marriage and deeply connected to Morgan's interests, organized a secret meeting. The location was Jekyll Island, Georgia, a private club where Morgan was a member. For over a week, Aldrich and representatives from the largest banks, including Frank Vanderlip of National City Bank and Paul Warburg of Kuhn Loeb & Co., designed the structure of what would become the Federal Reserve System. The meetings were held in absolute secrecy. They traveled to Jekyll Island in a private railway car using only first names to avoid identification. They told no one where they were going, because they knew that if the public discovered that bankers were designing the nation's monetary system, there would be riots in the streets. The plan they created was a masterpiece of political manipulation. The Federal Reserve wouldn't be called a central bank, it would be called a system, implying decentralization. It wouldn't be one institution, it would be 12 regional banks spread across the country. It wouldn't be controlled by Wall Street. It would be overseen by a board of governors appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. It looked decentralized. It looked democratic. It looked like government control. But the structure ensured that bankers maintained real power. The 12 regional Federal Reserve banks were privately owned by the member banks in each region. Those commercial banks elected the boards of directors for the regional feds. And the regional feds, especially the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, controlled the most important lever: open market operations, the power to create money and buy government bonds. The Federal Reserve Act was introduced to Congress in December 1913 during the Christmas recess, when many representatives had already gone home for the holidays. Most representatives didn't understand what they were voting for. The bill was 40 pages of dense financial legislation. It passed the House on December 22nd and the Senate on December 23rd. President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law on December 23, 1913. And immediately, the debt trap expanded into a new dimension. Now the government didn't just borrow from private banks, it could borrow from the Federal Reserve, which had the power to create money out of nothing to buy government bonds.
Here's the mechanism that enables infinite debt. The government issues a treasury bond, let's say $1 billion. The Federal Reserve buys that bond by creating $1 billion in new money, just credits it into existence on a computer. The government receives that $1 billion and spends it into the economy. The debt goes onto the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. The government promises to pay interest on that bond forever. Before the Federal Reserve, there was a natural limit to how much the government could borrow. Banks only had so much money to lend. Investors only had so much capital to invest in bonds. But the Federal Reserve removed that limit. It can create unlimited money to purchase unlimited government bonds. The government never has to worry about finding buyers for its debt because the Fed will always buy it. It could borrow forever, roll over debts eternally, and the system never has to clear. And who benefits? The interest payments flow from taxpayers to bondholders. And the largest bondholders are the banks that own the Federal Reserve System and the financial institutions that trade government securities. J.P. Morgan died in March 1913, 9 months before the Federal Reserve was created. But his legacy is the mechanism that makes America's current $38 trillion in debt possible. Without the Federal Reserve acting as a guaranteed buyer of government bonds, the market wouldn't support borrowing at this scale. Interest rates would spike. The government would be forced to balance its budget or default. But with the Fed as the buyer of last resort, with its ability to create infinite money, there is no limit. The debt trap became infinite, borrowing became perpetual, and the machine that Paterson invented and Rothschild globalized was now capable of expanding forever.
By the 1970s, the debt trap that Paterson invented, Rothschild globalized, and Morgan made infinite was functioning across the developed world. Every major nation borrowed continuously, rolled over debts, paid interest, and never reduced the principal. But developing nations were different. They borrowed heavily during the 1970s for infrastructure projects, industrialization, development, and many were struggling to keep up with payments. The trap was reaching a crisis point, until Paul Volcker made it permanent and inescapable. Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve in August 1979. He faced a serious problem. Inflation in the United States was running at over 13%. The dollar was losing value rapidly. Foreign governments were losing confidence in American currency. OPEC was demanding payment in gold instead of dollars. The entire post-war financial system, which was built on dollar dominance, was at risk of collapse. Volcker decided to break inflation, no matter the cost. In October 1979, he raised interest rates dramatically. The federal funds rate, the rate banks charge each other for overnight loans, went from 11% to 20%, the highest in American history. This crushed inflation. By 1982, inflation had dropped to under 4%. But it had another effect that Volcker certainly understood. Developing nations had borrowed hundreds of billions of dollars during the 1970s when interest rates were low. Mexico borrowed $80 billion. Brazil borrowed $60 billion. Argentina borrowed $40 billion. They borrowed at variable interest rates, meaning the rates adjusted based on market conditions. When Volcker raised U.S. interest rates to 20%, the interest rates on those developing nation loans tripled overnight. Countries that could barely afford the payments at 6% interest now faced payments at 18% interest. The interest alone exceeded their entire export revenues. They couldn't pay. On August 12, 1982, Mexico's finance minister announced that Mexico could not make its debt payments. Default. This should have triggered a global financial collapse. American banks, Citibank, Bank of America, Chase Manhattan, had lent most of that money to Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. If those countries defaulted, the American banks would have to write off tens of billions in losses. Some of them would fail. The entire banking system was at risk.
Volcker had a choice. He could let the market clear, let the banks take their losses, let developing nations default and start fresh, allow the system to reset. Or he could bail out the banks and trap the developing nations in permanent debt. He chose the trap. Working with the International Monetary Fund, Volcker orchestrated a bailout. The IMF would lend Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and other developing nations enough money to keep making interest payments to American banks. These were called structural adjustment loans. But the loans came with brutal conditions. Governments had to cut public spending, fire government workers, eliminate food subsidies, privatize state-owned assets like oil companies and utilities, open their markets to foreign investment, devalue their currencies to make exports cheaper, and essentially dismantle their economic sovereignty. Here's the key to understanding the trap. The IMF loans didn't reduce the debt. They didn't forgive anything. They just provided enough money to keep the interest payments flowing to American and European banks. The debt was restructured, extended, made manageable in the short term, but permanent in the long term. This is the Volcker innovation, the final piece of the trap. When debt becomes unpayable, you don't forgive it, you restructure it. You lend just enough to keep the interest payments flowing, and you extract political and economic concessions in exchange. The debt trap becomes a tool of control. Countries that couldn't pay were forced to open their economies to foreign corporations, sell their national assets to foreign investors, cut services to their own people, and submit to economic policies designed in Washington and New York. All in exchange for the privilege of staying in debt, of continuing to pay interest that could never eliminate the principal. This pattern has repeated for 40 years. Greece in 2010, Argentina in 2001 and again in 2018, Sri Lanka in 2022. Lebanon, Egypt, Pakistan, every time the same structure. IMF loans to prevent default, austerity imposed, sovereignty surrendered, and the debt never eliminated, just restructured, refinanced, made perpetual. Volcker died in December 2019, but his legacy is the mechanism that ensures the debt trap is global and completely inescapable. Even when countries literally cannot pay, even when the mathematics make it impossible, they're not allowed to default and start over. They're refinanced into permanent indebtedness. The interest keeps flowing upward to the same banks, the same institutions, the same system that Paterson created in 1694.
Now let me show you how these four architects built a system where debt is infinite and escape is mathematically impossible. Start with Paterson's foundation. Government borrows and pays interest forever, but never repays the principal. The debt is permanent by design. Add Rothschild's innovation, make the debt tradable globally, so it's not just one creditor, it's a web of thousands of institutions across dozens of countries. Default doesn't just hurt one lender, it collapses the entire interconnected system. Add Morgan's mechanism. Central banks can create unlimited money to buy government bonds. There's always a buyer. Government can always borrow more. There's no natural limit. Add Volcker's trap. When countries can't pay, restructure the debt. Don't forgive it. Keep the interest flowing. Use the debt as leverage to extract political and economic concessions. The result is what we have today: $315 trillion in global debt. Government debt, corporate debt, household debt, all interconnected through the financial system. None of it will ever be repaid. All of it pays interest. And default anywhere threatens collapse everywhere. Here's the specific mechanism in the United States. The government owes $38 trillion. Who owns it? About $20 trillion is owned domestically: pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, commercial banks, and the Federal Reserve itself. These institutions buy treasury bonds because they're considered the safest assets in the world. But those bonds pay interest, approximately $900 billion per year. That interest comes from taxes. So American taxpayers send money to the government through income taxes, payroll taxes, corporate taxes. The government sends that money to bondholders, and the bondholders are mostly institutions owned by or managing money for the wealthy. It's a transfer of wealth from workers to capital every single year, forever. The other $18 trillion is owned by foreign governments and investors. Japan holds over $1 trillion in U.S. treasuries. China holds about $850 billion. European institutions hold trillions more. This creates a mutual trap. If America defaults, it destroys the savings and reserves of its allies and trading partners. So they have to keep the system going.
Now, scale this globally. Japan owes $9 trillion, mostly to Japanese institutions and the Bank of Japan. Europe collectively owes $14 trillion, mostly to European banks and the European Central Bank. China has significant domestic debt held by state-owned banks. Every country is running the same system. And they're all interconnected. Japan holds U.S. treasuries. The U.S. holds European bonds through various channels. Europe holds developing nation debt through the IMF and World Bank. China holds U.S. debt. It's circular. Everyone owes everyone. And the interest flows upward to the institutions that manage the debt. Here's why this can never end, why the trap is permanent. If the United States paid off its $36 trillion in debt, the money supply would collapse. Because dollars are created when the government borrows. When the Fed buys a treasury bond, it creates new money. If the government paid off all its debt, all those dollars would disappear from circulation. The money supply would shrink by 2/3. Deflation would be catastrophic. Depression, economic collapse worse than the 1930s. So the government can never pay off the debt. It has to keep borrowing, keep rolling it over, keep paying interest. The same is true globally. If every government simultaneously paid off its debt, the global money supply would shrink by 2/3. There wouldn't be enough money in existence to conduct international trade. The system would seize completely. Debt cannot be eliminated. It's structural. It's the foundation of the money supply itself, by design.
And who profits from this? The institutions that hold the debt. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America. These asset managers and banks control tens of trillions in assets. They buy government bonds with other people's money. Your pension fund, your retirement account, your insurance premiums, and they collect the interest. About $900 billion per year flows from American taxpayers to bondholders just for U.S. debt. Add interest on Japanese debt, European debt, developing nation debt, and globally it's trillions per year, the largest continuous wealth transfer in human history. From workers to capital, from taxpayers to bondholders, from the bottom to the top. And it's invisible to most people because it's not called a tax. It's called debt service. But it's the same mechanism. You work, you pay taxes, the government sends that money to bondholders, and the debt never decreases. In fact, it only grows.
The four architects never met. They lived in different centuries.
They didn't conspire in a room together, but each one solved a problem in a way that benefited bankers and financial institutions, and each solution built perfectly on the previous one. William Paterson in 1694 made debt permanent. The loan never gets repaid. Interest flows forever. Nathan Rothschild in 1815 made debt global and interconnected. Default triggers systemic collapse, so default becomes impossible. J.P. Morgan in 1913 made debt infinite. Central banks can create unlimited money to buy unlimited bonds. There's no ceiling. Paul Volcker in 1982 made the trap inescapable. Even when countries can't pay, they're restructured back into the system. There's no exit. Together, across 288 years, they built a machine where governments borrow forever, pay interest eternally, and never escape. And the people who control the bonds, who manage the debt, who collect the interest, they are the ultimate beneficiaries. Not governments. Governments are trapped, not taxpayers. Taxpayers are the ones paying. The financial institutions, the asset managers, the banks, they hold the bonds, they collect the interest. And as long as confidence holds, as long as people believe governments will keep paying interest even if they never repay principal, the system functions perfectly.
$38 trillion in U.S. debt isn't a crisis for them. It's a business model. Every dollar of debt is an asset on someone's balance sheet. It pays interest. It provides collateral for more borrowing. It enables more money creation. And as long as the government exists, as long as it can tax, the interest flows. The debt trap is complete. Escape isn't possible without collapsing the entire global financial system. 4 architects, 3 centuries, 1 trap, and 8 billion people are now caught inside it. If this fundamentally changed how you see government debt, if you finally understand that $38 trillion isn't an accident, isn't incompetence, isn't a mistake, but a system working exactly as it was designed to work, then you're starting to see how power actually operates in the world. The machine was built intentionally. The trap was engineered deliberately, and it's functioning perfectly, exactly as the architects intended. Not to serve you, to extract from you, forever.